You've been told a lie that has followed you your entire life. A lie that quietly shaped your confidence, your health, and even the way you see yourself as a man. Most older men in America have no idea that the way they stop touching themselves or the way they continue doing it without awareness has silently cost them sensitivity, strength, vitality, and years of emotional well-being. And the truth is, none of this is your fault. My name is Doctor. For more than 30 years, I've sat across from thousands of men just like you. Men who were proud, disciplined, resilient, yet carrying private fears they never said out loud. Fears about fading desire, weakening erections, declining energy, and a growing distance from their own bodies. I know what those fears feel like because I've heard them whispered to me in exam rooms for decades. And here's the part no one ever told you. You weren't meant to stop. You weren't meant to go silent. You weren't meant to lose touch with the part of your biology that keeps your hormones alive, your prostate healthy, your blood flowing, and your spirit grounded. You were meant to evolve. What I'm about to share with you may challenge everything you thought you knew about aging, masculinity, and masturbation, but once you hear it, you may finally understand why so many older men struggle unnecessarily, and more importantly, how you can begin to reclaim your body in a way that feels natural, respectful, and life-giving. Stay with me because the truth you're about to hear could transform the next decade of your life. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and turn on the notification bell. Everything here is made specifically for men in your stage of life. And if this message already resonates with you, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. Now let's begin. Secret 1, mindless masturbation can lead to numbness and erectile decline. Most older men don't realize that the way they've been touching themselves for decades has quietly reshaped their nervous system. It usually begins innocently, a rushed moment in the bathroom, a familiar grip that never changes, a quick release done out of habit rather than connection. For years it feels harmless, routine, predictable, but inside the brain something very different is happening. Every repeated motion becomes a lesson, and the nervous system learns to expect only that specific pattern. What once felt effortless begins requiring more pressure, more intensity, or more stimulation just to feel anything at all. At first, men blame age. They think it's normal to lose sensitivity at 60 or 70, but it isn't age that creates the numbness, it's conditioning. I've had men sit in my office, their voice is barely louder than a whisper, saying, "I can't feel much anymore," or "I only respond if I do it one exact way." They look down at their hands as if they betrayed them, but the truth is much simpler and far more hopeful. They train their bodies without realizing it, and their bodies learned too well. When masturbation becomes mechanical, disconnected, and rushed, the brain starts shutting down natural pathways of arousal. Real intimacy feels too slow. Real touch feels too subtle. Real sensation begins to fade. And soon the same man who was once confident in his body begins to feel frustrated, anxious, even broken. But he isn't broken. His nervous system is simply overtrained in the wrong direction. The deeper tragedy is that mindless stimulation doesn't just change sensation. It can alter confidence, emotional presence, and even how a man relates to pleasure itself. When climax becomes the only goal, awareness disappears. Breath becomes shallow, muscles tighten, the mind drifts somewhere else instead of staying inside the body. And over time, this creates emotional distance that many men don't even recognize until years have passed. They begin avoiding intimacy, not because they don't want it, but because it no longer feels familiar. Their bodies have adapted to a rhythm that human touch can't replicate. But here's the part I want you to hear clearly. The nervous system can be retrained at any age, sensitivity can return, erection quality can improve, pleasure can deepen again. It doesn't happen by going faster or harder. It happens by slowing down, by changing patterns, by touching with curiosity instead of urgency, by reconnecting breath to sensation and presence to pleasure. When men begin doing this, even gently, the body responds in remarkable ways. Neural pathways reopen, sensitivity awakens, pleasure becomes richer, not because the body is young, but because it is finally being listened to. This first secret isn't about stopping masturbation, it's about transforming it. Because the real danger isn't the act itself, it's doing it without awareness. And while mindless stimulation can quietly drain your sensitivity, there is something even more hidden, even more overlooked, that affects millions of older men without them knowing. It's not about how you touch yourself, but what happens when you stop touching yourself altogether. And once you understand this second truth, you may never look at your prostate health the same way again. Secret 2, masturbation reduces prostate congestion and inflammation. Most men over 60 assume that if they're not sexually active, their prostate simply shuts down with the rest of their sex drive. They believe everything slows, quiets, and eventually stops needing attention. But the prostate is not a dormant organ. Even in your 70s or 80s, it continues producing fluid day after day, quietly doing its job, whether you acknowledge it or not. And when that fluid has nowhere to go, something begins to happen deep inside the pelvis, something most men misinterpret as just getting older. I remember a man named David, 68, polite, reserved, and clearly uncomfortable discussing anything sexual. He came to me complaining about waking up 5 or 6 times a night to urinate. He felt a constant heaviness in his pelvis, almost like a pressure he couldn't describe. When medication didn't help, he assumed it was simply age catching up with him. But when I asked him when he last ejaculated, he blinked at me in confusion. Years, he said, my wife passed away, and I thought that part of life was over. He didn't realize his prostate hadn't gotten that memo. When a man stops ejaculating for long periods, especially after 60, the fluid that the prostate produces begins to accumulate. This buildup creates a kind of internal reservoir, a swollen fullness that presses against the urethra and surrounding nerves. The result is congestion, frequent urination, nighttime urgency, slower stream, pelvic discomfort, and sometimes even pain. Many men accept these symptoms as an inevitable part of aging, but the truth is far more hopeful. These are not signs of decline, they are signs of stagnation. The prostate thrives on movement. Healthy ejaculation helps flush out old fluid, reduces inflammation, and keeps the tissue supple and active. When ejaculation disappears, the gland becomes congested, irritated, and more vulnerable to inflammation. Over years, this chronic inflammation can contribute to more serious problems. A major Harvard study following nearly 30,000 men found that those who ejaculated at least 21 times per month had a significantly lower risk of developing prostate cancer. Not because masturbation is a cure, but because a functioning prostate is a healthier prostate. When I explained this to David, he was stunned. No doctor had ever told him that avoiding ejaculation was contributing to his discomfort. With gentle guidance, he began reconnecting with his body, not out of lust or loneliness, but out of care. Within weeks, his nighttime bathroom trips decreased. The pressure in his pelvis eased. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of control over his own body. But something even more important happened. He realized he didn't have to give up this part of himself simply because he was older. Prostate health is not maintained by avoidance, it is maintained by engagement. Respectful, intentional, consistent engagement. And while understanding this physical truth can change a man's daily comfort, there is another force just as powerful but far more subtle that affects sexual health in ways most men never expect. It isn't biological, it's emotional. And for many men, it becomes the invisible weight that holds them back more than anything else. Secret 3, shame around self-touch damages your mental health. Shame is one of the quietest forces in a man's life, yet it shapes more of his health than almost anything else. Most older men grew up in a time when touching yourself was labeled dirty, sinful, weak, or something only foolish young boys did. Those messages didn't disappear as you aged. They stayed buried inside you, becoming part of the way you see your own body. I've watched men in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s stiffen the moment I ask a simple question about sexual habits. Their eyes drop, their shoulders tighten, they laugh nervously or change the subject, not because they don't understand the question, but because they've spent a lifetime believing they shouldn't answer it. One of my patients, a 72-year-old widowero, sat across from me with a heaviness in his voice that went beyond medical symptoms. He wasn't sleeping well, had lost interest in the things he once enjoyed, and described a numbness he couldn't explain. When I asked about intimacy with someone else or with himself, he shook his head slowly. "I closed that door years ago," he said. "It didn't feel right to do that at my age," but beneath his words was something deeper, a grief for a part of himself he had abandoned. Not because he wanted to, but because shame convinced him he should. Shame is not harmless. It changes the chemistry of the body. It raises cortisol, the stress hormone that disrupts sleep, increases blood pressure, damages memory, and drains energy. It lowers testosterone, which affects mood, vitality, and sexual function. Shame tightens muscles in the pelvis, restricts blood flow, and blocks the very pathways that allow pleasure and connection to unfold naturally. It doesn't just silence desire, it silences joy. Men often think they stopped touching themselves because they lost interest, but many times interest faded because shame shut down the system long before desire had a chance to speak. The body begins withdrawing. The mind follows, and slowly a man disconnects not only from sexual pleasure, but from emotional aliveness itself. It shows up as irritability, fatigue, sadness, and a sense of drifting. It becomes harder to feel present in daily life, harder to feel close to others, harder to feel anything at all. That 72-year-old man didn't need a pill. What he needed was permission to see self-touch, not as something inappropriate, but as a natural part of maintaining connection with his own body. I guided him through simple exercises designed to rebuild comfort and reduce shame. And over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. His sleep improved, his mood lifted, his sense of self returned, not because of arousal, but because he was no longer abandoning himself. Shame disconnects. Touch reconnects. And when a man reconnects with his own body, even gently, the nervous system begins to heal in ways that can transform his emotional and physical health. But while shame creates emotional distance, there is another force that affects men even more profoundly as they age, a biological shift that accelerates when sexuality fades from daily life. And once you understand this next truth, you may finally see why so many men lose their vitality faster than they should. Secret 4. Testosterone is stimulated by sexual activity even solo. Most men believe testosterone simply declines because of age, as if the body slowly turns off the very hormone that once fueled their strength, confidence, and desire. But what I've seen over more than 3 decades of treating men is far more revealing. Testosterone doesn't just fall because the years pass. It falls even faster when a man stops engaging with the part of himself that signals to his body, I am still alive. I still need this. Your hormones respond to your behavior, not just your birthday. I remember a man named Frank, a 73-year-old retired firefighter whose presence once filled every room he walked into. But the day he came into my office, his shoulders were slumped, his voice was faint, and he told me he felt like a dimmer switch had been slowly turning him down over the years. He wasn't exercising, he wasn't interested in intimacy, he wasn't even touching himself anymore. I just don't feel like a man these days, he said quietly. When we ran his labs, his testosterone levels were barely above clinical deficiency. When I asked him about sexual activity, he waved his hand dismissively. What's the point? That chapter is closed. But the truth is, the moment a man stops engaging sexually, whether with a partner or through mindful self-stimulation, his brain interprets that silence as a signal that testosterone is no longer needed. Hormone production slows, blood flow decreases, nerve pathways begin to quiet. The body responds not to aging alone, but to the message it receives. That desire and vitality are no longer part of the equation, yet the opposite is also true. And this is where hope enters the story. When a man begins waking his sexual self again, even gently and privately, the body listens. Anticipation alone can raise testosterone. Sensation, imagination, and presence all stimulate hormonal pathways that remind the brain you are still a living, breathing, vibrant man. When I guided Frank through simple steps to re-engage with his body, slowing down, breathing deeply, touching with awareness rather than urgency, something remarkable occurred. Within weeks, his numbers began to rise, his posture straightened, his energy returned, his voice regained its weight. He started lifting light weights again. He smiled more freely. He felt like himself again. Testosterone is not just a hormone. It is a reflection of engagement with life. When a man avoids his sexual self, his body dims. When he reconnects, even in small, intentional moments, his biology responds as if grateful to be awakened again. This is not fantasy. It is physiology. Your body wants to feel needed. It wants to stay alive. But while testosterone gives a man his energy and drive, there is another system just as important that many men unknowingly neglect. A system that determines whether erections stay strong or quietly fade over time. And once you understand how this next piece works, you may see aging in an entirely different light. Secret 5. Erectile function is a use it or lose it system. Most older men assume their erections fade because the calendar turns, as if time alone has the power to steal the strength they once relied on. But in my years of working with men, I've learned something far more important. Erections don't disappear because of age. They disappear because the body stops receiving the signals it needs to stay alive, flexible, and responsive. Erections are not a luxury, they are a vascular event. Blood flow, elasticity, oxygenation, nerve activity. And like any system in the body, when it is not used, it begins to weaken. I once treated a man named Harold, 69, intelligent, active, and in good health. He came to me embarrassed, not because he was experiencing erectile dysfunction, but because he hadn't had an erection at all, not even a morning one, in almost 6 years. My wife passed away, he said, and I figured that part of life was simply over. What he didn't realize is that his body had been quietly adapting to that decision. When we dug deeper, we discovered something most men are never told. The tissues inside the penis require regular oxygenation to stay healthy. Without periodic erections, those tissues begin to atrophy. The smooth muscle becomes less elastic. Blood vessels stiffen, microtears form, nitric oxide production declines, and before long, the system that once worked without effort becomes unresponsive. Harold was shocked to learn that erections serve a physiological purpose beyond sexual activity. They are a form of maintenance, a way for the body to keep the internal structures alive. When erections stop, whether due to grief, stress, shame, or simply the belief that sex is no longer relevant, the body assumes the system is no longer needed. It conserves resources, it redirects blood flow, and slowly the ability to become erect fades, not because the man cannot, but because the body has stopped trying. But here is the part that changed everything for Harold and for many men like him. The system can be revived. When I encouraged him to begin stimulating himself gently, not for performance, but simply for blood flow, something shifted. At first there was nothing, then faint responses. Then over weeks the body began remembering, tissue elasticity improved, blood flow returned, morning erections reappeared. His confidence lifted, his spirit brightened. He walked differently, spoke differently, looked different, because erections are not about ego. They are about identity, health, and the quiet reassurance that your body is still responding to you. This is why consistent erotic or non-erotic stimulation matters. It is not about chasing climax. It is about keeping the vascular system engaged, signaling to your body that this part of you still matters. And while reawakening erections can transform your physical confidence, there is another force, subtle but increasingly common, that threatens men's sexual health in a completely different way. It has nothing to do with aging and everything to do with the modern world. And once you understand how it affects your brain, your desire, and your sensitivity, you may realize you've been battling an enemy you never even saw coming. Secret 6. Porn changes your brain, but you can take control. Many older men are surprised when I tell them that pornography affects them far differently now than it did when they were young. Back then, erotic images were subtle, slow, and left room for imagination. Today, the content is fast, extreme, and crafted to overwhelm the senses. And while younger brains can adapt and reset quickly, the aging brain processes stimulation in a profoundly different way. It doesn't just watch porn, it rewires itself around it. But most men never realize this is happening until the consequences feel personal, embarrassing, or irreversible. I once spoke with a man in his late 60s who confided in me with a mixture of shame and frustration. He told me he could get fully aroused while watching porn, but when he tried to be intimate with a real partner, nothing happened. I feel broken, he said quietly, like my body has two different settings and the one I actually want doesn't work anymore. What he didn't know is that his experience was not rare. It was neurological conditioning, and it can happen to men of any age, but especially to those whose nervous systems are more sensitive to overstimulation as they grow older. When porn delivers constant novelty, rapid scenes, and exaggerated scenarios, dopamine floods the brain. The reward circuits adapt quickly, demanding more intensity to feel the same level of excitement. Over time, real touch feels too slow. Real intimacy feels too gentle. Real connection feels too human. Sensitivity drops not because the body is failing, but because the brain has learned to require stimulation that real life cannot replicate. The man begins to chase an artificial high while losing access to natural arousal. But here's what I always tell my patients. You are not damaged. You are not weak. Your brain simply adapted to the stimulation it received most often. And the same brain that learned those patterns can unlearn them. Neuroplasticity does not disappear with age. Healing is possible at 70. That man looked at me as if hearing hope for the first time in years. We created a plan that involved stepping back from porn gradually, slowing down his self-stimulation, reconnecting breath to sensation, and allowing arousal to unfold naturally instead of forcing the body to perform. Within weeks, his sensitivity began to return. Within months, he experienced his first partner-driven erection in years, not because he tried harder, but because he allowed his brain to reset. The deeper lesson is this: porn itself is not the enemy. Losing control of your relationship with pleasure is. When a man learns to guide his arousal rather than be guided by a scream, he regains not only sensitivity, but confidence, presence, and emotional clarity. And while modern overstimulation can reshape the brain, there is a force even more damaging to a man's well-being. Something that affects his hormones, his heart, his mind, and his lifespan far more powerfully than porn ever could. It's not about stimulation at all. It's about the absence of it. And once you understand this final truth, everything about aging, intimacy, and vitality will look different. Secret, the most dangerous mistake, isolation. Isolation is one of the most powerful forces working against the health of older men, yet it's also one of the least recognized. It doesn't arrive suddenly or dramatically. It creeps in quietly, disguised as routine, disguised as independence, disguised as the belief that a man should simply get used to being alone. But the body is not designed for that kind of separation. The nervous system longs for touch. The heart longs for connection. The skin itself is wired to respond to warmth, pressure, and closeness. When those disappear, the brain begins to dim parts of a man's emotional and physical identity he never meant to lose. I once met a 76-year-old man named Peter, a retired engineer who carried himself with dignity, but spoke with a distant calm that didn't match his age or intelligence. He told me he hadn't been touched by another human being in over a year. No hug, no hand on the shoulder, no casual brush of connection. He hadn't touched himself either, not sexually, not even absent-mindedly. I don't see the point anymore, he said, but beneath that statement was something deeper, a quiet surrender. It wasn't a loss of desire, it was a loss of self-recognition. When touch disappears from a man's life, his brain interprets it as emotional withdrawal. Oxytocin levels fall, stress chemicals rise, and the body begins conserving energy in ways that limit vitality. Sleep suffers, motivation fades, depression increases, even cognitive function declines. The man does not feel this all at once. He feels it as a slow fading of color. Food tastes less interesting, days blend together, joy becomes muted, and because this change is gradual, he rarely realizes that the root of his decline is the simple absence of human or self-directed touch. What Peter needed was not a pill or a procedure. He needed reintroduction to the most basic form of human connection, touch itself. When I guided him through intentional self-cont, not erotic, just grounding, something began to shift. The numbness he described wasn't physical. It was emotional insulation his brain had built as protection against loneliness. Slowly, as he reconnected with the sensation of his own hands, his nervous system began to wake up, his posture lifted, his energy returned. He spoke with more clarity, because when a man reclaims touch, he reclaims his presence in the world. Isolation may be silent, but its consequences are not. It affects hormones, cardiovascular health, immune function, memory, and emotional stability. It influences how a man sees himself and how he moves through each day. And the first step in reversing its impact is recognizing that touch is not a luxury. It is a biological need, especially after 60 when the body depends on signals of connection to stay alive and responsive. But understanding these 7 truths is not enough. Your body will only change when your actions change. And that brings us to the next part of this journey, the simple daily ritual that can begin transforming your sensitivity, your confidence, your hormone balance, and your emotional vitality. These are the steps you can start today, and the impact may surprise you. Secret 8, what you need to do today. After hearing these truths, many men ask me the same question. Where do I even begin? They feel the weight of years of silence, years of habit, years of believing their bodies were simply fading because of age. But change does not require youth. It requires intention. Your nervous system, your hormones, your prostate, your erections, your emotional health, they are all waiting for one thing, a signal that you are ready to come back to yourself. And the most powerful change begins not with a drastic overhaul, but with a simple, deliberate daily practice. I call this the golden protocol. But what matters is not the name, it's the purpose. You start with 10 minutes, just 10, not to chase climax, not to perform, not to fix anything. These 10 minutes are about reconnecting with your body in a way that honors your age, your experience, and your humanity. Find a quiet space, sit comfortably, place your hand over your chest or your abdomen, and notice your breath. Feel the rise and fall. This is the first step, presence. When a man learns to slow his breath, his entire nervous system begins to shift from tension to receptivity. Then bring your attention to your body. Noticing warmth, pressure, sensation, touch yourself gently, not sexually at first, just intentionally. The skin sends powerful messages to the brain, messages that awaken pathways long ignored. As you explore, let go of old habits, the rushed grip, the tight shoulders, the disconnected mind. Replace them with curiosity. What does this feel like today in this moment? Slowing down teaches your brain to re-engage pleasure circuits that have been dormant. If arousal begins naturally, follow it slowly. If it doesn't, There is no failure. This ritual is not about results. It is about returning to awareness over time. This practice improves blood flow, increases sensitivity, lowers stress hormones, and supports hormonal balance. It can reduce prostate congestion, revive erectile tissue, and rebuild confidence. Most importantly, it helps a man reclaim the emotional and physical parts of himself that life may have pushed into the background. I've seen men who felt numb for years suddenly feel warmth move through them again. I've seen men who thought their erections were gone rediscover spontaneous arousal. I've seen men who carried shame for decades finally breathe with ease. This daily ritual is not magic, it is biology supported by presence. 10 minutes a day is enough to begin telling your body, I am here, I am listening, I still matter. And here is the truth. When a man commits to this small act of self-connection, everything else in his life begins to shift. His confidence, his clarity, his sleep, his strength, his relationships. It is the foundation upon which every other improvement stands. But while this ritual awakens the body, there is one final message that awakens the spirit. A message I want you to hear not just as a doctor, but as a man who has spent decades watching other men come back to life. And it may be the most important thing you take away from this entire journey. Conclusion. If you have made it to this point, I want to speak to you with the honesty and compassion that every man deserves, but very few ever receive. Everything we've discussed today is more than biology, more than technique, more than hormones and nerves and blood flow. It is about reclaiming the parts of yourself that life, age, responsibility, grief, silence, or shame may have slowly taken from you. I have spent over 30 years listening to men, strong men, hardworking men, quiet men, wounded men, tell me their deepest fears in hushed tones. Fears of losing their vitality, fears of disappointing a partner, fears of losing their identity as a man, fears of aging into invisibility. And almost always those fears had nothing to do with failure. They had everything to do with being uninformed, unprepared, and unprotected by a society that never taught men how their bodies truly work. What I want you to understand is this. Nothing about you is broken. Nothing about you is too late. Nothing about you is beyond repair. Your body is still listening. Your nervous system is still capable of awakening. Your hormones are still responsive. Your erections can still be trained. Your prostate can still be supported. Your mind can still be rewired. Your heart can still be soothed. You are not past the point of reclaiming your strength and sensuality. You are at the perfect point to begin again because now you understand what no one ever told you. You have learned that mindless stimulation can dull sensitivity, but mindful touch can restore it. You have learned that avoiding ejaculation can congest the prostate, but regular release can protect it. You have learned that shame damages mental health, but self-compassion heals it. You have learned that testosterone responds to engagement, not age. You have learned that erections depend on use, not luck. You have learned that porn can rewire the brain, but your brain can be rewired back. You have learned that isolation quietly dims a man's spirit, but connection, especially with your own body, can relight it. And most importantly, you have learned that a simple daily ritual can begin transforming the way you feel from the inside out. Your next step is not to chase perfection, it is to choose presence. 10 minutes a day of intentional connection with your body will do more for your long-term vitality than any supplement, any device, any promise sold on late-night television. You do not need to be 20 again. You only need to be fully alive at the age you are now. I have watched men in their 60s regain confidence. I have watched men in their 70s restore sensitivity. I have watched men in their 80s rediscover pleasure, not because they turned back time, but because they finally understood their bodies and gave themselves permission to feel again. As you move forward, let this be your guiding truth. Your body has not given up on you. It has only been waiting for you to return. And now that you have the knowledge, the awareness, and the tools, the question becomes simple. Will you let this be the moment everything changes? Because what I'm about to share next is the final piece, perhaps the most important message of all, that will determine how you move through the years ahead and how fully you reclaim the man you still are.